Hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Read The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. This week we're looking at Chapter 10, The Evidence of Consciousness, the Enigma of the Mind. The chapter opens with an extended discussion of Ray Kurzweil's ideas about artificial intelligence. I'm not sure how accurately his ideas are portrayed, but the basic idea of this section is that if we increase the computing power and the complexity of computers sufficiently, they will eventually become conscious. Strobel compares that idea with his understanding of an evolutionary explanation for consciousness, saying, "At some point, the human brain evolved, with its raw processing power increasing over the eons. When the brain reached a certain level of structure and complexity, people became conscious. That is, they suddenly developed subjectivity, feelings, hopes, a point of view, self-awareness, introspection, that hidden voice of our private selves." This is a straw man. It is not argued that there is some threshold of processing power or complexity below which there is no consciousness and above which you have human-like consciousness. What is generally thought is that consciousness exists on a spectrum. Most people would accept that newborns do not have the same degree of consciousness as adults, nor are animals either conscious or not. Instead, there are degrees of consciousness, and even adults will have different levels of consciousness depending on how awake they are, or if they are under the influence of drugs, mental health issues, or brain injuries. Similarly, most people would agree that animals like fish probably aren't conscious. Mice may have low levels of consciousness, dogs somewhat higher, chimpanzees higher still, and humans are probably the most conscious. This establishes a progression of increasing consciousness with increasingly complex brains. Still, Strobel wants to argue that consciousness arising from non-conscious life is simply not possible, and to this end he quotes from John Searle, a philosopher. Unfortunately, although Strobel manages to mine a quote that he thinks supports him, Searle's actual views are that consciousness is an entirely physical process. Strobel then quotes another intelligent design advocate from the Discovery Institute, this time William Dembski, and he closes the section with this. "Amazingly, many scientists and philosophers are now concluding that the laws of physics and chemistry cannot explain the experience of consciousness in human beings. They are convinced that there is more than just the physical brain at work, but there also is a non-material reality called the soul, mind, or self that accounts for our sentience." I'd probably agree that the laws of physics and chemistry aren't enough to explain our experience of consciousness. I think that's like using experimental psychology to try and explain history. Sure, ultimately human history comes down to the individual actions of human beings, and these choices are, in principle, explicable through psychology, but the two fields operate on vastly different scales. Similarly with physics and consciousness. The scientific field best placed to explain consciousness would probably be neuroscience and its many subdisciplines. Also, I'd be surprised if there were many scientists who had scientific reasons for being convinced there is a non-material reality. My admittedly non-expert understanding is that there is simply no scientific evidence in support of the idea of a non-material reality. The only arguments in favour of substance dualism that I've ever come across are philosophical, not scientific in nature. I certainly have never come across a scientist presenting scientific evidence for the existence of a soul, as Strobel seems to be claiming. In this section, Strobel argues that there is considerable controversy over what consciousness is and how it works. He does this by quoting from Wilder Penfield, who he describes as the renowned father of modern neurosurgery. Penfield did pioneering work in brain surgery and in mapping the parts of the brains that correspond to sensations from and control of different parts of the body. In 1978, he wrote a book called The Mystery of the Mind, in which he argued that the mind and the brain are distinct. The reason that Penfield came to believe in substance dualism, according to Strobel, is because he could induce altered states of consciousness on his patients by stimulating parts of their brain. In particular, by electrically stimulating parts of their motor cortex, he could force them to move one of their hands. And despite challenging them to keep that hand still, the patients were unable to, even when they used their other hand to try and stop it from moving. Strobel's quote puts this as, "One hand under the control of the electrical current and the other hand under the control of the patient's mind fought against each other. That is, Penfield's interpretation was that since the patient didn't want his hand to move, the patient must in some way be distinct from his brain. The problem with this is it seems to me to be no more evidence for an immaterial mind than the fact that I can't consciously stop my heart beating, or keep my foot still if you activate my patellar reflex. I mean, anyone who's had an addiction knows fully well that the mind is not always a coherent entity with a singular purpose. I mean, it's not uncommon to have a higher level desire, but to be unable to corral your baser impulses to your purposes. And that's the only evidence that Strobel presents here. I mean, Penfield himself only gives an argument from incredulity, saying that the idea that the brain could be entirely responsible for consciousness is quite absurd. Strobel then goes on to mention Sir Charles Sherrington and John Eccles's belief in a soul. I mean, and the problem here is that while these two were eminent physiologists, they were also devout Christians before they were scientists. While they may have made peace between their faith and their scientific work, I mean, there's no suggestion that they actually believed in souls for scientific reasons. Strobel closes the section with the question, is it really rational to believe in dualism in the 21st century? A question that is already pretty well answered by his inability to quote from a credible scientist who did any work more recently than 1975. In this section, Strobel introduces the idea that near-death experiences provide evidence for mind-body dualism. The idea here is that if people who are clinically dead have mental activity, or if an out-of-body experience can lead to experiences that are not naturalistically explainable, then this would be strong evidence for a non-physical mind. And on this, he is correct. I mean, if patients who have no brain activity were later revived and had memories of events from when they were dead, this would be difficult to account for naturalistically. Even more telling would be if patients who had an out-of-body experience witnessed something that they could not possibly see from their physical position. I mean, if either of these things were established to be possible, it would be compelling evidence for mind-body dualism. The problem is that there is very little evidence for either. I mean, the best that Strobel can muster is this. A study of 63 heart attack victims who were declared clinically dead but were later revived and interviewed. About 10% reported having well-structured, lucid thought processes with memory formation and reasoning during the time that their brains were not functioning. The problem with this is that it really doesn't establish anything like what Strobel wants to imply. Interviewing patients about their remembered mental states after their resuscitation cannot establish that their minds were actually functioning at the time they were dead, unless they happen to remember important details of their operations. And that has never happened. Anyway, I think Strobel knows that this is actually very weak evidence, because despite this potentially being incredibly strong evidence, he moves on after only a couple of paragraphs. He quotes a few physicalist scientists, that is, scientists who don't believe in mind-body dualism, that establishes that we don't have a decent explanation for all aspects of consciousness. And then he argues that since science hasn't ruled out an immaterial mind, that therefore there is no quarrel between theology and findings of recent research. He has a couple of quotes about the Christian belief in a soul, completely abandoning the idea of a non-Christian intelligent designer that most of the other experts in this book have actually been arguing for. After these three introductory sections, which is more than the last few chapters have had, we get onto the interview itself. This section is Strobel's typical biography of Moreland, listing everything he's ever written. The only interesting thing to me is that he has an undergraduate degree in chemistry, but then switched to theology. I feel that this hardly makes him the most qualified expert to discuss whether recent scientific research supports mind-body dualism, but he's not the first dodgy choice of expert in this book. This section contains some basic definitions, which is good, since at least we know what we are arguing about here. Moreland defines consciousness as what you're aware of when you introspect, which is somewhat simplistic, but certainly good enough for these purposes. The next thing is the soul, which he defines as. The soul is the ego, the I, or the self, and it contains our consciousness. It also animates our body. That's why, when the soul leaves the body becomes a corpse. The soul is immaterial and distinct from the body. The problem with this definition is it doesn't tell us much, and basically just asserts that it exists. It seems to be saying that the soul is a combination of our sense of self and a vital force. The problem with this is that to say that consciousness is part of the soul is begging the question, when he hasn't actually established that a soul exists. And the idea that soul animates the body is, at best, an unnecessary hypothesis. We need no soul to explain why bodies live and die, how biological processes work, and what happens when we die. To say that the body becomes a corpse when the soul leaves is like saying that God pulls the apple to the ground when it falls from the tree. I mean, we can't prove it wrong, but it hardly adds to our understanding of physics when we understand gravity already. The last thing in this section is Moreland arguing that the mind-body dualist view is common, saying, we know that dualism was taught by the ancient Greeks. In contemporary terms, I'd agree with physicalist Jagon Kim, who acknowledged that something like this dualism of personhood, I believe, is common law shared across most cultures and religious traditions. This is an appeal to popularity. I'd agree that people are generally naive dualists. We also tend to naively believe in free will. This doesn't mean that either position is actually correct. Without thinking clearly, we tend to simply trust our subjective experiences, but science has shown us that they are not reliable. We need to have other evidence or reasons to confirm our subjective experiences, and I look forward to Strobel and Moreland providing these. Physicalism is simply the idea that there is no immaterial world. That is, the material world is all there is. On a simplistic level, it's not far from what most people would mean by naturalism. In this section, Moreland presents 3 objections to physicalism. That is, 3 reasons why substance dualism must be true. Quote, first, if physicalism is true, then consciousness doesn't really exist, because there would be no such thing as conscious states that must be described from a first-person point of view. If everything is physical, it could be described entirely from a third-person point of view, and yet we know that we have first-person subjective points of view, so physicalism can't be true. This is the entirety of his argument from consciousness. The part that I've snipped out is simply elaboration. As best as I can understand it, this is what most philosophers would call qualia. Qualia is just the fancy philosopher's term for our subjective experience of the world. That is, things like the feeling of warmth, what red looks like, or the taste of salt. These are experiences that we can talk about, but unlike other kinds of knowledge, we can't directly share these experiences with other people. It seems that Moreland is arguing that a third-person, objective description of these experiences can't capture their essential characteristics, and therefore there must be something immaterial about them. Now, this is intuitively plausible, but our intuitions are not reliable. Also, we're getting into fairly deep philosophy here, and I'm not a deep philosopher. However, I do have 2 objections to this argument. Firstly, his argument, as presented, is actually invalid. Physicalism would entail that there are no experiences that must be described from a first-person point of view, not that they couldn't be described from this point of view. That is, he hasn't established that simply because we have a subjective experience of the world, this means that these experiences can't be described objectively. Secondly, philosophers do defend physicalism. Their argument, basically, is that if we could exactly reproduce the materials, structure, and activation patterns in one brain, in another brain, then they would have the exact same first-person experiences. This is like the brain in a vat or matrix scenario. If you're plugged into a computer that provides a perfect simulation of the world, then there's no reason why it couldn't provide the same experience to someone else. Now, philosophers disagree with whether this is possible or not, but so far science has given us no reason to think that it isn't, at least in theory, possible. And for Moreland to simply assert that first-person experiences present an insurmountable problem for physicalism is a grossly dishonest representation of the field of philosophy. Moreland's second objection to physicalism is that it would prevent free will. after making a kind of bizarre diversion to argue that a belief that people behave like robots is what caused the US to lose the Vietnam War, Moreland argues against physicalism like this. So, if materialists are right, kiss free will goodbye. In their view, we're just very complicated computers that behave according to the laws of nature and the programming we receive. But Lee, obviously they're wrong. We do have free will. We all know that deep down inside. We're more than just a physical brain. This is pitiful philosophy. I feel I've got free will, therefore I've got free will is no argument. And the majority of philosophers recognise this. And the majority of philosophers recognise that the kind of free will that Moreland is talking about doesn't exist. This is surprising to anyone who hasn't given much thought to the matter, but it's pretty well settled that the universe is deterministic. That is, it is entirely governed by natural laws, and there's no reason to think that human actions are anything except the result of these natural laws as applies to our constituent parts. The only real philosophical debate is whether the kind of choices that we can make are worthy of being called free will. I mean, the only people who still argue for what's known as libertarian free will are Christians, simply because Christian theology insists it must exist. The basic problem with Moreland's argument here is that having the experience of free will is perfectly compatible with physicalism. If physicalism is true, then it's theoretically possible for us to construct an incredibly complex and powerful computer that can mimic our experiences. This computer could be programmed to feel like it has free will and to be convinced that it does have free will, but it wouldn't. In this way, just because someone feels like they have free will doesn't mean that they do, or that physicalism is wrong. The third argument that Moreland has in support of mind-body dualism is the existence of out-of-body experiences during near-death experience. I've already been over this before, and Moreland doesn't even present a decent case here. He says that we're not sure they're true, and seems uninterested in actually making much of a case. The section ends with this gem from Moreland. Regardless of what anyone thinks about near-death experiences, we do have confirmation that Jesus was put to death and was later seen alive by credible eyewitnesses. Not only does this provide powerful historical corroboration that it's possible to survive after the death of our physical body, but it also gives Jesus great credibility when he teaches that we have both a body and an immaterial spirit. If Jesus' resurrection actually had been established, then we wouldn't need this book. It'd just be, page 1, Jesus died and was resurrected, therefore Christianity. No need for a page 2. And the fact that Moreland is just slipping this in as an afterthought means that neither he nor Strobel actually take it seriously as an argument. Not to mention that the only account we have is from the Bible, and using the Bible to prove Christianity true is almost the definition of a circular argument. Still, I guess Strobel figures if you made it this far, you'll probably swallow anything. Having presented these three poor arguments, Moreland and Strobel believe that they've settled this 1,000-year-old philosophical debate in a little under 3 pages. In this new section, we have Moreland give 4 more arguments in support of mind-body dualism. Firstly, he argues that experiments on people's brains support it. Quote, Penfield electrically stimulated the brains of epilepsy patients and found he could cause them to move their arms or legs, turn their heads or eyes, talk or swallow. Invariably, the patient responded by saying, I didn't do that, you did. According to Penfield, the patient thinks of himself as having an existence separate from his body. No matter how much Penfield probed the cerebral cortex, he said, there is no place where electrical stimulation will cause a patient to believe or to decide. That's because those functions originate in the conscious self, not the brain. There is much wrong with this. That the patients didn't feel like they were causing the movements that were induced is hardly surprising. This is exactly how it feels when someone activates your patellar reflex by knocking on your knee, or what it's like to have a panic attack. The fact that these things weren't consciously controlled doesn't prove that there's an immaterial soul. Also, that Penfield, in the first half of last century, couldn't induce beliefs or decisions in patients using direct electrical stimulation of the brain doesn't establish that mental activity must be non-physical. It's quite possible that beliefs or decisions are the result of complex activation patterns across complicated regions of the brain. A belief or a decision is far more subtle a mental state than gross motor movements. And inducing such things is likely to be outside of our abilities for a long time to come. That's hardly an argument for mind-body dualism. Moreland then claims that Roger Sperry's research supports dualism, which is simply dishonest. Sperry's research does not support his claim that the mind has causal power independent of the brain's activities. If anything, it lent further support to the idea that the mind is entirely dependent on the brain. Anyway, Moreland just makes the assertion as a throwaway comment, so I won't spend any more time on it. The next piece of research that Moreland claims supports dualism was published in a theology journal. And again, Moreland doesn't spend any time actually discussing the result, so I'll just note that if publications in theology journals are the best evidence he has, then it's hardly a scientific argument. Moreland's next argument is that brain states can't account for mental states, saying, for example, some of my thoughts have the attribute of being true. Tragically, some of my thoughts have the attribute of being false. However, none of my brain states are true or false. No scientist can look at the state of my brain and say, oh, that particular brain state is true and that one's false. So there's something true of my conscious states that are not true of any of my brain states, and consequently they can't be the same thing. This is simply false. We can measure some brain states, and although current techniques are crude, we can identify what some of these brain states mean. For example, there's currently a method that involves using brain scans to communicate with people with locked-in syndrome. This is where the person is apparently in a coma, but they still have brain activity. So by directing the patient to think particular thoughts to indicate a yes or a no, and monitoring their brain activities, doctors have been able to communicate with them. If you ask these patients a question about reality, and their thought responses are either true or false, they are exactly what Moreland is claiming they can't be. And while this research occurred after the publication of this book, it was still wrong to assert at the time that such a thing was impossible. There was no known reason why it wasn't possible, and Moreland doesn't give any, simply asserting that it isn't. And he's been proven wrong in the last 10 years, is part of the reason why I don't just accept these assertions that Strobel's experts have been making throughout this book. The next argument that Moreland gives in support of mind-body dualism is the argument from intentionality. His argument is this: nothing in my brain is about anything. You can't open up my head and say, you see this electrical pattern in the left hemisphere of J.P. Moreland's brain? That's about the bears. Your brain states aren't about anything, but some of my mental states are, so they're different. That's the entirety of his argument. It's simply an assertion that they must be different without evidence. I'm going to dismiss it for the same reason as his previous assertions. Suffice to say that the argument from intentionality hasn't convinced expert philosophers. The last argument that Moreland presents in this section is the argument that consciousness is fundamentally private. Quote, furthermore, my consciousness is inner and private to me. By simply introspecting, I have a way of knowing about what's happening in my mind that is not available to you, my doctor, or a neuroscientist. A scientist could know more about what's happening in my brain than I do, but he couldn't know more about what's happening in my mind than I do. He has to ask me. Like his previous arguments, he would actually need to establish this rather than just asserting it. And like with his previous assertions, it's quite possible that this will turn out to be wrong. I can see no in-principle reason why it would be impossible to replicate the structure, material, and activation pattern in one brain in another. Sure, it's utterly beyond our current technological capabilities, and maybe eternally beyond our capabilities, but I can think of no reason why our mental states need be unassailably private. In fact, as I pointed out before, we can already use brain scans to gain direct knowledge of some people's mental states. In this section, Moreland argues that the soul comprises the basic unit of self and is more than simply our consciousness, personality, or memories. The idea is that there is an essence of self that transcends these psychological or cognitive components. He begins by telling the story of a woman who had an accident and as a result lost her memory and experienced a change in her personality. Moreland makes his argument like this. Now, we all knew this was the same person all along. She was not a different person, though she was behaving differently. But she had totally different memories. She had lost her old memories, and she didn't even have the same personality. What that proves is you can be the same person even if you lose old memories and gain new memories, or you lose some of your old personality traits and gain new personality traits. This is begging the question and the reification fallacy. Again, Moreland is simply asserting that she's the same person, but he doesn't justify this or even clarify quite what he means by it. Also, he's simply asserting that who she is, the essence of herself, is a thing that is unchanged by the accident. But there's no reason to believe that we have some essential self that is separate from our personality, behaviour, and memories. To see why this argument is wrong, suppose that during her accident she became lost and was significantly disfigured. She was then hospitalised and received significant cosmetic surgery, dramatically altering her appearance. Now, if she had profound amnesia and coincidentally came into contact with her friends or family, would they recognise her as the same person as Moreland would have it? I'd argue that they wouldn't, and that she wouldn't be the same person. If she lost her memories, had a significantly altered personality, and a drastically different appearance, it's hard to argue that she is the same person in any meaningful sense. This is the philosophical problem of the ship of Theseus, as applied to people. In essence, the ship of Theseus paradox asks whether an object that's had all of its components exchanged still stays the same object. For example, if my chair's leg breaks and I replace the leg, most people would agree that it's still my chair. But if I repeatedly break and replace components until not a single original component remains, that is, every single part of the chair has been replaced, in what sense can I say that it's the same chair? And if it's not, then when did it cease to be my original chair? This is what's wrong with Moreland's idea, that someone can be the same person while their personality, memories, or behaviour are significantly modified. He then goes on to argue that a person can't be divided into pieces. You're either a person or you're not, which falls prey to the same objection. We know that personhood is a continuum. We don't consider newborns or embryos to be full people, just as we don't consider the significantly mentally ill either. We acknowledge to be fully a person, you need to fulfill several criteria. And contrary to Moreland's assertions, we know that people who lose portions of their brain can lose aspects of their personhood. People with head injuries that render them unable to plan or act or control their impulses are not considered equally people in the eyes of the law. They're every bit a human, and they're worthy of respect and dignity, but they don't have the same capabilities, and we don't consider them to be the same. Anyway, Moreland makes this same assertion a few different ways through the rest of the section before moving on to the next section. In this section, Moreland argues against computers ever gaining sentience, with the idea that no matter how complex computers become, they will never gain consciousness. He asserts that a computer has no insides, no awareness, no first-person point of view, no insights into problems. The problem with this is that he's equivocating on the word computer. If by computer he means the computing devices that we currently use, then I would agree with him. The way that current computers are programmed, the way they function, may well never produce consciousness, as it is a fundamentally different approach to intelligence to the biological approach. This has become quite clear over the last several decades, as the kind of problems that people find trivial, like walking, talking, listening, are actually incredibly difficult for computers. But the kind of problems that computers find trivial, like adding, multiplying, searching through data, are incredibly difficult for people. But the way that we build computers now need not be the only way to do so. I mean, imagine building a computer that works more like a biological brain with artificial neurons. Moreland gives no reason why such a computer like that couldn't become consciousness, and it's this equivocation that he's relying on. Moreland then defines what he means by consciousness, as part of his attempt to argue that computers can never be conscious. Now remember that earlier in this chapter, he defined it, consciousness, as what we're aware of when we introspect, look inwards. That is something like our thought processes. Here he says, a computer can engage in behaviour if it's wired properly, but you've got to remember that consciousness is not the same as behaviour. Consciousness is being alive. It's what causes behaviour in really conscious beings. But what causes behaviour in a computer is electric circuitry. His assertions here about consciousness are very much in dispute. It is assumed that our consciousness causes our behaviour, but it certainly hasn't been proven, and some philosophers and even scientists think otherwise. In fact, it has been established that much of our behaviour is not caused by our consciousness, but rather by unconscious or reflexive drives. Also, again, this is just Moreland asserting his conclusions. He's not actually making an argument. He then references Thomas Nagel's essay, What is it like to be a bat?, which has been highly influential in arguing for mind-body dualism. Moreland provides this assertion. A future superintelligent computer might be programmed to say it's conscious, or even behave as if it were conscious, but it can never truly become conscious, because consciousness is an immaterial entity apart from the brain. It's the same old assertion he's been making all chapter, again, without any actual evidence or argument. This section is Moreland arguing that naturalism can't account for the emergence of consciousness. He quotes philosopher Geoffrey Meddal as saying, the emergence of consciousness, then, is a mystery, and one to which materialism fails to provide an answer. Strobel provides no source for this quote, and the only sources I could find were all quoting this book. Regardless, he is wrong to say that materialism fails to provide an answer. It has simply failed so far to give an adequate answer. To say that materialism can't ever account for consciousness would actually require some argument to support it. Moreland's main argument here is that if physicalism or materialism is true, then consciousness and other mental processes must have arisen from non-conscious or non-mental processes. Quote, if you apply a physical process to physical matter, you're going to get a different arrangement of physical materials. And if the history of the universe is just a story of physical processes being applied to physical materials, you'd end up with increasingly complicated arrangements of physical materials, but you're not going to get something that's completely non-physical. That is a jump of a totally different kind. Which is the same argument he's been making all chapter, just framed now in terms of matter and the laws of physics. All he's really saying is that consciousness is non-physical, therefore it can't come from arrangements of matter, therefore physicalism is false. But he hasn't actually established that consciousness is non-physical, so the rest of it fails. Anyway, Moreland's explanation for how consciousness arose is to invoke God, saying, if you begin with an infinite mind, then you can explain how finite minds came into existence. That makes sense. Except that it doesn't. It's a nice soundbite, but the existence of an infinite immaterial mind is hardly a straightforward explanation for the emergence of consciousness. I mean, if anything, it just pushes the problem up a level. Despite Moreland having presented several arguments against physicalism, and several arguments in favour of substance dualism, in this section he presents another 5 arguments. The idea that Moreland is arguing against here is that consciousness is an emergent property of matter. The emergence view of consciousness argues that it is simply the product of complex interactions between matter, akin to how a sufficient quantity of ants can build complex anthills by only following simple rules. His first objection to this idea is, first, they are no longer treating matter as atheists and naturalists treat matter, namely as brute stuff that can be completely described by the laws of chemistry and physics. Now they're attributing spooky, soulish, or mental potentials to matter. He elaborates that he means that if mental properties emerge through complex interactions, then in some way these properties must be present in the material before it emerges. But this is simply missing the point of emergent complexity. Conway's Game of Life is a computer program with trivially simple rules, but from which incredibly complex behaviour can emerge. The point is there's no potential complexity written into the rules. The complexity emerges directly from having a sufficient number of simple elements. Each element is simple, but combined they can engage in complex emergent behaviour. Next, Moreland argues that if consciousness is emergent, then determinism is true, and we can't have libertarian free will. I've covered this before, and it's hardly a problem. Everyone who looks at the issue and is not religiously motivated inevitably concludes that reality is almost certainly deterministic. The third argument that Moreland makes is that if consciousness is simply a product of natural laws, then how can we trust any of our reasoning? He puts it like this. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say you had a computer that was programmed by random forces or by non-rational laws without a mind behind it. Would you trust a printout from that machine? Of course not. Well, same with the mind, and that's a problem for Darwinists. And by the way, you can't use evolution as an explanation for why the mind should be considered trustworthy, because theoretical thinking does not contribute survival value. Of course, this misses the point. If his hypothetical computer consistently produced trustworthy printouts, then yes, I would begin to trust it. The situation is exactly the same with human reasoning. We don't trust it just because, but rather because using our powers of reasoning, we can produce reliable knowledge. And he's also wrong about evolution. Since the world is predictable in many aspects, there is survival value in theoretical thinking. I mean, early humans that could predict where and when animals would migrate were better at hunting and surviving. As our social groups became larger, we needed better abstract thinking to help us manage our increasingly complex social life. I mean, in fact, the reliability and the quirks of our thinking are best explained by evolution. A creator God offers little explanation for our consistent cognitive biases and the blind spots in our thinking. Evolution does. Moreland's fourth argument is that consciousness that emerges from our physical brain cannot explain the existence of a unified sense of self. Quote, if my mind were just a function of the brain, there would be no unified self. Remember, brain function is spread throughout the brain. So if you cut the brain in half, like the girl who lost 53% of her brain, then some of that function is lost. Now you've got 47% of a person. Well, nobody believes that. We all know she's a unified self because we all know her consciousness and soul are separate entities from her brain. Except that we don't all know that. In fact, generally, when people do lose parts of their brain, they do lose specific functions. And specific mental problems can be linked to specific parts of the brain. Obviously, for some functions, it's much more complex than a simple mapping between a chunk of the brain and a cognitive ability. But there's ample evidence that our mental abilities are tied directly to our brains. Some mental illnesses, like schizophrenia, can directly challenge one's unified sense of self. And this seems strongly grounded in the brain. Otherwise, why would psychiatric drugs work? Moreland goes on to argue that if the mind was physical, then each individual part of the brain would have its own sense of self, which is just stupid. It's like saying that if the eye is purely physical, each part of the eye would see its own individual image. Strobel asks Moreland about recent studies that have shown that we can induce mental states that are similar to religious experiences simply by stimulating parts of the brain. Moreland dismisses this. He argues that brain activity correlates with mental activity, but this doesn't mean it's causal. In essence, his argument is that on his account, there's an immaterial mind that is causally connected with the brain. Changes in the brain causes changes in the mind, and changes in the mind can cause changes in the brain. The problem with this is that it is, again, asserting the existence of an immaterial mind without evidence, and unnecessarily so. Strobel seems to have noticed that since on Moreland's account the mind is little more than an intermediary between different brain states, perhaps this is susceptible to Occam's razor. I find it odd, since by this point in the chapter, Moreland has presented at least 10 reasons why an immaterial mind must exist. Of course, they aren't successful arguments, but since Strobel's accepted them, I'm not quite sure why he's bringing up Occam's razor. Anyway, I think that Occam's razor is relevant here, since I don't think it has been established that there is any phenomenon that cannot be accounted for by physicalism. Here's Moreland's argument. The relationship between the mind and the brain is contingent or dependent. In other words, the mind is not something that had to happen. One atheist asked, why should any experience emerge when these neurons fire in the brain? He's pointing out that there's no necessary connection between conscious states and the brain. Curiously, despite extensive footnoting, this quote from one atheist isn't sourced, and I can't find it anywhere. Still, this argument is wrong, and for the same reason that all of his other arguments are wrong. He is simply asserting that the mind is not contingent on the brain, without actually giving any evidence or reason for this. It's the same assertion he's been making all chapter. In this section, Strobel starts by quoting Alvin Plantinga, which is a bad sign. Plantinga is a good example of a seemingly intelligent philosopher who is motivated by religious beliefs to say stupid things. Anyway, the thrust of this section is that evolution can't explain the origin of consciousness since the mind is distinct from the brain. Moreland and Strobel then go on to discuss what attributes of God we can deduce from the existence of our own consciousness. This is just unwarranted theology and it's hardly interesting. The last section of the chapter has Strobel reflecting on the interview, and he summarises Moreland's arguments like this. Interestingly, this very act of introspection intuitively affirmed to me what Moreland's facts and logic had already established. My ability to ponder, to reason, to speculate, to imagine, and to feel the emotional brunt of the interview showed that my mind surely could not have been the evolutionary byproduct of brute, mindless matter. Of course, Moreland didn't actually present any convincing facts or logic, and so the entirety of his argument boils down to this. My subjective experience means that my mind can't just be caused by my brain. Unfortunately for Strobel, subjective experiences are rarely good arguments for deeper problems in ontology. And that's it for this chapter. The whole chapter has consisted of Moreland pointing at aspects of consciousness and arguing that they couldn't possibly be explained in materialistic terms. This same assertion was made in several different guises, and at least once it's been disproved in the last 10 years since this book was published. That's the only argument he has. And given that this book is supposed to be about scientific evidence for God, this chapter was severely lacking in scientific arguments. Anyway, there's only one more proper chapter left in this book, thank goodness. Join me next week for the final chapter, The Cumulative Case for a Creator. See ya.